On a grey February morning inside London's High Court, something happened that few people in that room will ever forget. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, almost clinical. And yet it carried the force of an earthquake. Have you ever witnessed a single sentence change the course of someone's life? According to those present, that's exactly what unfolded when a private message was read aloud, just 11 words. 11 words that, in that still courtroom, seemed to split open not just a marriage, but an entire public narrative surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The words were simple: make him tear up when discussing Diana. No shouting. No dramatic tone. The judge read them in the same measured voice she had used all morning. But the impact was immediate. Those who watched Harry closely said they saw the change in seconds. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened. Then, gradually, he seemed to fold inward. 4 years, the world had seen him as a soldier, a prince, a husband, a son still shaped by the death of Diana. But in that moment, he appeared simply as a man blindsided by something he had not expected to hear. And here is the question many over 40 quietly asked themselves while watching the coverage. What would it do to you if you discovered that your deepest grief had been discussed as a strategy? This was not just about embarrassment. It was about intention. When private pain becomes public strategy. The messages in question were part of a broader legal battle, originally framed as a dispute over privacy. Few anticipated that it would evolve into a forensic examination of language, tone, and motive. As more texts were read aloud, a pattern reportedly began to emerge. They were not emotional outbursts or casual complaints. They were described as structured, deliberate, almost like notes from a planning session. Bullet points. Timing suggestions. Observations about public perception. One message allegedly referred to a family dinner as a gold mine of reactive content. Another suggested shaping Harry's public appearances to bake empathy into the narrative. And then came a phrase that left many stunned. He wears grief like silk. We just need the right lighting. Grief like silk. For a generation that remembers watching a 12-year-old boy walk behind his mother's coffin in 1997, that phrase struck hard. Many viewers in their 40s, 50s, and 60s remember exactly where they were when Diana died. They remember the flowers outside Kensington Palace. They remember the silence, the shock, the sense that the world had briefly stopped. So the deeper question became, was Harry's grief authentic, or had it been shaped for maximum impact? Or perhaps more painfully, could both things be true? Is genuine sorrow diminished when someone else learns how to frame it? Does guidance become exploitation when emotion enters the marketplace? The courtroom did not answer these questions. It simply allowed them to hang in the air. Rehearsed emotion or media coaching? The courtroom reportedly examined communications tied to major interviews, including the couple's high-profile televised conversations. Messages suggested reviewing phrasing, timing, and emotional delivery. Now, let's pause here. Is media preparation unusual? Of course not. Politicians rehearse. Actors rehearse. Even business leaders rehearse before high-stakes interviews. But where is the line between preparation and manipulation? Some of the annotations allegedly included instructions like, pause longer here. Insert breath for emotional effect. Glance down when mentioning your brother. If true, these details suggest not just preparation, but choreography. For a mature audience that values authenticity, especially when discussing mental health and family, this raised uncomfortable questions. When Harry spoke about feeling trapped, about estrangement, about his grandmother, about the institution, were those words entirely his? Or had they been carefully shaped behind the scenes? And if someone guides you on how to express your pain, does that make the pain less real? Or does it transform private emotion into performance? The distinction may seem subtle. Yet in that courtroom, it appeared enormous. The message that changed the room. 2 hours into the reading, another text reportedly shifted the tone entirely. He still wants their approval. It's pathetic, but I can use it. Those who observed Harry that day say this line hit differently. There were no visible tears this time. Just stillness. Approval. What son doesn't want approval from his father? What brother doesn't long for reconciliation? What human being doesn't seek acceptance from those who raised them? For viewers over 40, many of whom have navigated strained family relationships, the idea that such vulnerability could be described as leverage felt deeply unsettling. Then came another line that reportedly froze the courtroom. The guilt over his mother makes him easy to redirect. That's the engine. Redirect. Engine. These are mechanical words. Strategic words. Words that suggest movement guided by unseen hands. And suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about marital strain. It was about whether emotional wounds had been treated as fuel. Could love and strategy coexist? Can someone be both partner and architect of another's public identity? The courtroom offered no verdict on emotion. It simply presented language. The business of trauma. As proceedings continued, the messages were grouped into themes: monetization, family strategy, emotional leverage. One section allegedly outlined how certain family tensions could sustain long-term public interest. Another discussed pacing disclosures to avoid trauma fatigue. A phrase reportedly used to describe their streaming deal referred to it as a pension vehicle. If accurate, that language reframed public confessions as assets, renewable resources in an ongoing narrative economy. Now consider this carefully. Is it wrong to tell your story and earn from it? Not necessarily. Many memoirists and public figures do exactly that. Survivors write books. Veterans share experiences. Public figures build platforms around personal history. But the ethical tension arises when personal healing intersects with calculated brand expansion. For older audiences who have built careers, raised families, and endured real hardship away from cameras, the idea of packaging trauma as serialized content feels jarring. Especially when children are mentioned in strategic terms. One message reportedly discussed future relevance cycles tied to family milestones. Another suggested controlling exposure to maintain mystique. This raised another uncomfortable question. At what point does storytelling become commodification? Where is the boundary between protecting privacy and manufacturing scarcity? The atmosphere in the courtroom. Witnesses later described the courtroom's atmosphere as heavy, not dramatic, but dense with tension. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Outside, February rain tapped steadily against the tall windows, as if marking time. Observers leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single word. Journalists scribbled furiously. Some spectators watched Harry instead of the judge, studying every shift in posture, every flicker of expression. At times, he appeared distant, as though retreating inward. At others, he sat rigidly upright, hands clasped tightly together. What thoughts moved through his mind in those moments? Was he replaying past conversations? Was he questioning memories once considered certain? No one could know. But the visual image of a public figure confronting private words in a public setting became one of the day's most discussed aspects. A marriage under the microscope. The proceedings did not present a simple story of villain and victim. Instead, they painted a complex portrait of partnership, influence, and mutual ambition. Some communications suggested collaboration rather than control. Strategic discussions appeared to involve both voices. Decisions about public positioning seemed, at times, jointly considered. This complexity raised further questions. When two people build a shared public identity, where does influence end and agency begin? If one partner shapes the narrative, does the other participate willingly, or gradually surrender autonomy? Can power within a relationship shift so subtly that neither person notices until much later? For many observers, the case seemed less about blame and more about dynamics, the invisible forces that shape relationships under extraordinary pressure. Public image versus private reality. One recurring theme in the messages was perception management. Language referenced narrative control, empathy arcs, and public alignment. These phrases suggest a world where identity itself becomes a project, carefully constructed, continuously refined. Yet most people live differently. Their arguments are private. Their grief unfolds behind closed doors. Their reconciliation, when it happens, is witnessed only by those directly involved. So what happens when a life becomes a narrative consumed by millions? Does the need for coherence reshape reality? Do individuals begin to live the story they have created? The courtroom seemed to explore this tension between authenticity and performance. And perhaps this is what fascinated the public most, not simply the allegations themselves, but the broader question of how modern identity is constructed in the age of constant visibility. The weight of legacy. Underlying the entire case was the shadow of legacy: family legacy, institutional legacy, personal legacy. For Harry, his mother's memory has always been central to his public identity. The courtroom discussions repeatedly returned to that loss, examining how it influenced decisions, statements, and emotional responses. But grief is not static. It evolves over decades. It shapes choices in ways both conscious and unconscious. So another question emerged. When personal history becomes public currency, who owns the story? Does the individual control the narrative, or does the narrative begin to control the individual? For those who have lived long enough to carry decades of memory, this question resonates deeply. Everyone carries private chapters. But not everyone must defend them in a courtroom. The view from the public. Outside the High Court, reactions were immediate and divided. Some saw the messages as evidence of manipulation. Others viewed them as routine strategic planning unfairly interpreted. Still others questioned the authenticity of the messages themselves. Public opinion fractured along lines of belief, loyalty, and personal experience. Why do we respond so strongly to the lives of public figures? Is it because their stories mirror our own conflicts, family tension, identity struggles, the search for belonging? Or do we simply project our fears and hopes onto people we will never meet? The case seemed to function as a cultural mirror, reflecting society's anxieties about truth, authenticity, and influence. The silence between words. Perhaps the most striking element of the proceedings was not what was said, but what remained unsaid. There were pauses after certain messages. Moments when the judge looked up briefly before continuing. Moments when the room seemed to hold its breath. Silence can reveal as much as speech. What emotions filled those quiet spaces? Regret, shock, recognition, or simply the weight of realizing that private language had become public evidence? In those silences, observers projected their own interpretations. The broader cultural question. Beyond the individuals involved, the case raised a broader cultural issue: the transformation of personal life into public narrative. In an era of social media and constant exposure, many people curate their own stories, selecting images, shaping perception, managing identity. Are we all, in smaller ways, engaged in similar acts of narrative construction? Do we present curated versions of ourselves to gain approval, sympathy, or influence? If so, where is the boundary between natural self-presentation and calculated performance? The courtroom drama seemed to amplify these everyday questions to extraordinary scale. As the day ended, no final judgment had been delivered. The proceedings would continue. Legal arguments would follow. Evidence would be challenged. Interpretations would evolve. But for those who witnessed that February morning, the memory that lingered was simple: a quiet room, a measured voice, 11 words, and the visible reaction of a man confronting a version of his story he had never expected to hear. And the questions remained. Can love and strategy coexist without corruption? Can grief remain sacred once exposed to public analysis? Is authenticity possible in a world that rewards performance? Perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: if our private words were one day read aloud, stripped of context, frozen in time, what story would they tell about us? The High Court session ended without spectacle. Papers were gathered. Chairs shifted. The rain outside continued to fall, steady and indifferent, as if the world beyond the courthouse had no interest in the fragile dramas unfolding within. Yet the echoes of those words, quiet, clinical, irreversible, continued to reverberate far beyond the courtroom, leaving a public audience to wrestle with a story still unfolding and a truth that may never be fully resolved. Some texts reportedly referenced deciding how Windsor, the children, should appear publicly. Titles and optics were weighed. Branding potential was discussed. Language that once might have been dismissed as gossip now carried the weight of legal scrutiny. That is when the story stopped being gossip and became something more sobering. Because now it wasn't just about Harry. It was about legacy. Legacy, after all, is not merely what one inherits, it is what one leaves behind. It shapes identity, informs belonging, and binds generations together. And when legacy itself becomes a matter of strategy, the emotional consequences can be profound. What happens when heritage is not simply lived, but carefully curated? What becomes of authenticity when image takes precedence over experience? The final blow. Toward the end of the session, the judge reportedly read one final message. Harry's love for them is a vulnerability. If we don't manage it, it will derail everything. Not love for a spouse. Love for his family. In that single sentence, many observers felt the entire drama crystallized. The atmosphere in the courtroom reportedly shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A tension settled over the room, heavy with implication. If love itself becomes a liability to be managed, what does that say about the relationship? Love is often described as strength, a force that sustains people through hardship. Yet here it was framed as risk, as exposure, as something requiring control. For many listening, the statement raised a troubling possibility. Can affection remain pure when treated as a strategic weakness? And here is the uncomfortable reflection for anyone who has been married for decades. Can a partnership survive once you believe your emotions were curated? Can intimacy exist where calculation quietly shapes expression? These questions lingered long after the courtroom emptied. The royal response. In the aftermath, attention turned to the royal family. Official statements were restrained, almost deliberately neutral. Publicly, there was no gloating, no triumph, only a careful acknowledgement of ongoing legal processes. Privately, however, sources described fatigue more than fury. Meanwhile, Prince William was said to be deeply unsettled. For him, this was not constitutional. It was personal. Brotherhood is not a public role. It is something forged in childhood, shared memories, private jokes, unspoken loyalty. Observers noted that while public anger often flares and fades, perceived betrayal between siblings leaves a different kind of scar. It reshapes memory itself, forcing one to reconsider moments once believed sincere. Public reaction. A shift in sympathy. Within days, public opinion began to shift, especially in the United Kingdom. But what made this moment different from past controversies was not outrage. It was something quieter, more reflective, pity. Many viewers who had criticized Harry in recent years suddenly saw a different picture. A man who might have been guided, influenced, perhaps even steered by forces he did not fully recognize. For people in midlife and beyond, who understand how easily perception can be shaped by a dominant voice in a relationship, this analysis resonated deeply. It wasn't about villains and heroes anymore. It was about agency. How much of our identity is truly our own? How often do we adopt narratives presented by those we trust most? And when realization arrives, what remains of certainty? The children at the center. Amid all the analysis, two young children remain at the center of this storm. For parents watching this unfold, one thought likely overrides all others. How do you protect children from adult strategy? Childhood ideally exists as a space of innocence, shielded from calculation and conflict. But when family dynamics become public narrative, that protection becomes difficult to maintain. What does it mean for a child to grow up under scrutiny, aware that identity itself may be debated by strangers? If Harry's greatest wound was feeling managed by forces beyond his control, the idea that his children might experience something similar would be devastating. And so the question deepens. Can cycles of emotional control be broken, or do they inevitably repeat across generations? 3 roads ahead. At this point, Harry faces 3 possible paths. He could stay and attempt reconciliation, rebuilding trust in private. That would require extraordinary forgiveness, patience, and a willingness to confront painful truths. Reconciliation demands vulnerability from both sides. But can trust, once questioned, ever return to its original form? He could leave, divorce, disentangle, and navigate international custody complexities. That would require enormous strength, resilience, and acceptance of public scrutiny. Independence offers clarity, yet it often comes at the cost of stability. Or he could return to the United Kingdom quietly, not as a working royal, but as a son seeking grounding. That would require humility and courage, a willingness to step away from established narratives and rediscover personal identity. Each path carries cost. Each path demands sacrifice. And here's the deeper question for you. At this stage in life, what matters more, reputation or reality, public perception or private peace, security or self-discovery. For a man who has lived under scrutiny since birth, perhaps the hunger now is not for applause, but for something far simpler: truth. A final reflection. In the end, this story is not about headlines. It is about something many of us come to understand with age. Love is not proven in public statements. It is proven in private loyalty. Trust, once fractured, is never repaired by branding. It is repaired by honesty. And grief, especially the grief of a child who lost his mother, should never feel like stage direction. Whether Harry chooses to stay, leave, or return home, one truth seems unavoidable. He is no longer just navigating public opinion. He is navigating identity, who he is beyond expectation, beyond narrative, beyond performance. And perhaps that is the universal element within this story. We all, at some point, confront the tension between who we are and who we are expected to be. We all face moments when private truth collides with public image. So let me ask you, can a marriage survive once strategy replaces sincerity? Can a family heal when every word has been analyzed? Can identity endure when shaped by external expectation? And if you were in his place, what would you choose? Security, independence, or home? Share your thoughts. This isn't just a royal story. It's a human one.